So, Laura Bates, author of The New Age of Sexism, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast to talk about your book. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm sure that many of our listeners are familiar with a lot of your work, starting with Everyday Sexism, the website that you founded more than a decade ago now, inviting women to share their experience of sexism, as well as, many of your other books you've written since. But this new book looks at the ways in which misogyny is being embedded in tech and the ways in which technology also kind of reveals where misogyny exists and how it operates. I'd love to know what made you decide to take this angle. Why this book now?
Um, because it feels so urgent. We are at a kind of precipice. I think there were some elements of the ways in which technology is being used to enable sexual abuse, stalking, in particular, that are really scary. For example, the fact that you can take a photograph of a woman that you know, a woman in real life, and you can have a highly realistic sex robot replica made of her down to the last freckle, and there's nothing she can do about it, and then you can then do whatever you want to that robot.
One of the things that I found really sort of stark in the book, you open with a chapter about deepfakes, and you say, everybody says, the threat of deepfakes upending our democracy. It hasn't quite happened. We had a massive year of elections last year. People knew if candidates were really talking. It didn't do it in your, and you kind of say, well, yes, but also women are being victimized en masse by deepfake pornography, and nobody's talking about it as a sort of urgent issue.
Yes, women are talking about it, and survivors are really bravely raising their voices and fighting for change and for people to pay attention. But in that kind of media sphere and political sphere, there's this sense that the risk from deepfakes comes from that threat to essentially male politicians and to kind of potential democratic erosion, which is, of course, a very important future threat to think about and talk about. But it's so frustrating when you see a Europol report, for example, on how we should police and tackle deepfakes coming out that's 22 pages long and mentions women once and has two small paragraphs on sexual deepfakes, when the reality is that 96% of all deepfakes are pornographic in nature and 99% of those feature women, including women in politics. 30 female politicians in the UK who saw hundreds of these images and videos made of them and put on a website where they were viewed 12.6 million times. There's your threat to democracy that's happening now. But because as a society we collectively have this assumption that women in the public eye will face threats, abuse, unbearable forms of intrusion on their lives and harassment, it's somehow that's not seen as a fundamental issue that we should be grappling with. It's just kind of taken as inevitable. An inevitable byproduct of technological progress will be the increased abuse of women and girls, and that seems to be something people are quite prepared to just accept.
You say that so sort of the next big epidemic of sexual violence will come from, or is, in that example, kind of already coming from the leveraging of AI.
Yes.
Um, and there's a phrase that you use that AI is encoding yesterday's hatred into the foundations of tomorrow's world. I think was a very kind of succinct way of summarizing what you think the impact will be. But I'd love to know,
Yes.
how is this weaponization going to be different to other forms of misogyny, maybe that we've seen in the past? What's
Yeah.
different about this misogyny that AI is now propagating or spreading?
Yeah, so the reason this is happening is because the way that a lot of AI tools work is to ingest vast amounts of existing data and then to use that in an extremely intelligent way to guess at what the likely kind of next word is or next piece of code is or next thing is that it wants to create. The problem with that is that the vast majority of existing data sets we have are riddled with the existing inequalities of today's society, so misogyny, racism, and so on. The real problem with our AI in terms of where it gets a bit different is that these tools won't just regurgitate and kind of vomit back the same existing levels of misogyny and racism at us, because the way the tools work is that they are explicitly designed to eliminate outliers, because that way they are most likely to be getting the most likely correct thing to guess. And of course, that's not significant if they're eliminating outliers when it comes to, trees or something like that. But it really, really matters actually if they're eliminating diversity or individuals who are outliers in society. And it then suddenly becomes very serious and very impactful.
And we could talk a lot about all the things that you kind of uncover in the book. You go to some really dark places. You have experiences that I think that from the way you write, you find quite traumatizing. You spent time talking
Yeah.
to kind of AI girlfriend chatbots. You really test out the limits of some of this technology. But it would be great to talk a little bit about whether you think it's possible for the internet to be equal, to be feminist, having seen all of these things. Like, where do you see the possibility for that sort of equal internet and technology?
I mean, it's absolutely theoretically possible for there to be not just equitable, but actively feminist and progressive tech. There's no reason the tools can't be harnessed in that way. The tools themselves are neutral. The problem is that the ways in which they are being developed, both deliberately in some cases, as we've seen with deepfake tools being used to kind of strip any woman or girl that you want to after you screen grabbed her image from the internet, but also unintentionally where existing bias is encoded as a kind of byproduct. The ways in which the tools are currently being created, which is a kind of gold rush arms race by a relatively small group of mainly white billionaire men, very much kind of to the end goal of increasing their already obscene profits, is resulting in a situation where very little of the tech and the tools being produced does have that kind of equitable or progressive impact. And there are brilliant examples of AI being used in very progressive and useful ways, to do things like analyze court and sentencing decisions to recognize and pull out patterns of racist and misogynistic bias so that those can be corrected. You can build AI tools which exist to police other AI tools and to spot where bias is being encoded and to prevent it. So theoretically, yes, it's possible, but realistically within the system that we have and the way in which tech has been monopolized by a small sort of broligarchy, a small group of men, as Carol Cadwalader has coined it, who are also extremely closely aligned with and in very, very close communication with very powerful politicians who are advocating against moderation, against regulation. I think it's very difficult to see a pathway forward where that world in which tech is equitable and thoughtful and progressive is likely to come to pass.
Shall we talk a bit maybe about what those big tech companies say they're doing or,
Yeah.
are doing to protect not just women but also minorities, basically, to avoid all kinds of hateful things taking place on
Mhm.
their platforms. What's your view? What are they doing?
Well, what we know is that there has always been a dramatic gap between the things that these big tech companies say and the things that they do when it comes to safety, when it comes to supporting marginalized groups, when it comes to preventing abuse. These are companies which will say, for example, there is no place on our platform for various different forms of prejudice and hatred, and will then absolutely spew out and support the algorithmically facilitated radicalization of millions of young people using their platforms into precisely those forms of hatred. They will have great sounding moderation standards and policies, but when women who are experiencing horrendous waves of abuse are reporting that content to the platforms, they will be repeatedly getting an automated bounce back response that says, this doesn't violate our terms. So I think the problem is the gap between what they claim, which is very much, we take this seriously. There is no place on our platform for any of this kind of content. And the reality of what anybody can see is actually happening on their platforms. There was a study recently that found that if you start a new TikTok account in the name of a teenage boy, it takes less than 30 minutes before the first piece of extreme misogynistic content will be promoted into your feed. You don't have to go looking for it. It will come to you. And yet I'm quite sure that TikTok will say there is no place for misogyny on our platform.
I mean, can anybody, well, so if this is how companies currently operate, what can be done to kind of reform perhaps the approach of those companies? Is that the responsibility of government, or does it have to come from within these tech companies themselves, that they see a problem and they fix it?
It's never going to come from within tech companies themselves. We know that because we know that they are well aware of these problems. They have been pointed out to them time and time again. We also know from kind of leaked internal documents that they've looked at fixes, and what they tend to find is that the fixes are absolutely possible, but they will incrementally negatively impact engagement, which is the kind of holy grail of every tech company, because engagement is what leads to advertising revenue and profit, essentially. And we have seen repeated cases where tech companies have been aware of a problem, they've been aware of potential fix, and they've chosen not to do it because essentially it will affect their bottom line. So the only way that this is going to change is if we have regulation that comes from governments, and ideally from governments cooperating internationally with some kind of a global framework for regulation. And that doesn't mean stopping innovation or progress or, harnessing the many very real ways in which AI and emerging technologies could have a very positive impact on our world and our society. It just means bringing tech in line with, frankly, every other sector, where the idea of baseline, common sense, bespoke regulation at the point of release of products to the public is considered completely normal and acceptable. The only reason that we kind of balk at this and that it is considered a bit controversial or shocking is because the tech sector has always played by different rules. I think that young women are increasingly aware of their rights and of feminist movements in ways that are very exciting and give you hope for the future. But I do think that we are at a uniquely dangerous moment in that there has always been ebb and flow with the kind of arc of these things. There's always been a sense in which progress is followed by backlash, and there are 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But never before in history has that backlash been facilitated by immensely powerful algorithms. So I think that we are at risk of a moment where we might see the backlash take us several steps further backwards than we've managed to move forwards, and that is really deeply worrying. And that's backed up by the kind of opinion polling that we are seeing, which for the first time in history is suggesting that the most outdated, regressive, conservative attitudes towards women and their bodies are most likely to be held by the youngest cohort of men surveyed, which has never been the case before. It's always previously been the oldest cohort surveyed.
You say towards the end of this book, that writing it made you angry. And that, that kind of vision of the future that you just sort of gave us a hint of there is very worrying, the attitudes that the youngest members of society kind of have about women. But what gives you hope about the future when you've immersed yourself in this, in the reality of the misogyny of the world in which we live? From where do you draw optimism?
Well, I think the optimism and hope are linked to the anger, actually. I think that women's anger has been stigmatized for centuries, and we have been taught that it is unfeminine and unattractive and unappealing. But actually, I think the fact that more and more women are very angry is the thing that gives me hope, because we should all be absolutely furious that this moment of global transformation that we are poised on the brink of, something akin to the Industrial Revolution is what we are about to see. We should all be absolutely furious that it is being hijacked by this incredibly small number of unelected billionaires using it as their personal playground to enrich themselves further at enormous cost to the planet, to the most vulnerable communities. That is something we should be furious about. And if enough of us get angry enough, I feel hopeful that there is still power in democracy, that there is still power in collective citizen voice, in protest, in calling on our elected representatives to recognise that they have the power to act and that we want them to act and to regulate now before it's too late. And seeing the efforts of, incredible frontline feminist organisations, academics, campaigners, young women who are fighting so hard to give voice to that anger in a very righteous way, that gives me hope.
Laura, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us on the Prospect podcast to talk about your very important book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.